Good afternoon. Sean here, Mountains Garage. Outside it's a balmy 95 degrees, and in my cave of a shop, I'm all the way up to 71. I might have to turn the fan on. So my cleaning project is suspended outside for a few days. I'd progressed to the point where I'm moving stuff to one of the outside storage boxes, and it's way too hot there. So I don't know how the people in the south and out west deal with the heat and humidity. It's not for me. The beauty of New England, in a few days, Wednesday, cool air is going to blow in. It'll be sunny and 70 for another week. But you didn't come here to talk about the weather. Let's talk about the old manual transmission, or the standard transmission. Did you ever wonder why it's called a standard transmission? Well, if you looked at your option sheet and you didn't select anything, you got the standard equipment. I believe that's where the name came from. You could probably get a 3-speed on the column. The standard transmission, no options. You can debate that if you want, but that is what I believe. So let's just call it a manual transmission. For the subject today, it's mostly General Motors, but the other brands will play in. I'm not going to cover the cast iron 3-speed and the cast iron 4-speed passenger car transmissions because they're about as weak as they come. We used to use them for wheel chocks. Nowadays, they're worth money. The stock car people still use them. They're fine if you're just putting down the road. You got an old hot rod you're not going to abuse. Land speed, racing, stock cars. They've found a use over there. They're still relatively cheap and abundant. And in any application where you're not going to stress them, you'll be all right. That brings us to the aluminum 4-speeds that were available in GM cars. And I hate to burst the bubble, but they're also very weak. Different manufacturers had different ways of determining how many foot-pounds of stress they will stand, but the testing I read about was on the Muncie. You can tell it's a Muncie because there's 7 bolts in the side cover. A T10 has 9. So if you're just walking up to a GM 4-speed, somebody tells you it's one or the other, just count the bolts in the side cover. There's a lot of other clues, but that's the easiest one. To test, they lock the output shaft and start applying stress on the input shaft in first gear, which is the weakest ratio. The strength of a transmission is how far apart the cluster gear is from the main shaft, and that allows you to have bigger gears. And to a point, that's an advantage. Eventually, the gears will be so big, it'll be a disadvantage. So in this testing device, they've locked the output shaft, they're putting stress on the input shaft, they've got a dial indicator in the middle of the case because first gear is the furthest gears back on your cluster. And they start applying stress to it, and they watch the case spread or deflect, and the OEM gears being brittle, when they start to spread apart, they're going to break the tips off, and that leads to gear destruction. There are aftermarket transmissions available in both of these with an improved case. You'll see it has a lot more ribs to counteract deflection, and the stronger gears can operate with a little bit of separation out on their tips and still not break. Also, the helix of the gear, these have a helix cut in them to be quiet. Once again, concessions are made, much like in an automatic, for driver comfort, not necessarily for transmission strength. The legendary M22 Muncie had gears that they weren't straight cut, but they were less of a helical cut. They push apart less under load, and that transmission had a slightly higher torque rating, but still nothing great. This was about 300 to 320. It depends on your first gear ratio. These only came, both of the Super T10 Borg Warner and the Muncie was either a close ratio or a wide ratio. The Super T10 actually came in 5 different ratios. The Muncie only came in 2. You had a 220, 2.20 first gear, that'd be a close ratio, and you had 2.54, that'd be a wide ratio. Now those numbers are important. We're going to reference this a few times. Your overall first gear ratio on an average street-driven car should be between 8 to 1 and 11 to 1 to be drivable. So you multiply the first gear, in this case, let's call it 2.54, and say you had a 350 rear end, 342, you're going to be about 9 to 1, approximate. If you have a close ratio of 220, you need to be about a 410 or 411, whatever you want to call it, to have the same overall first gear ratio, but the car with the wide ratio transmission and the higher rear gear, now high is lower numerically and low is higher numerically, so 411s are lower than a 350. A lot of people get that backwards. So when we talk about higher or low gears, a high gear would be in a rear end ratio in the 2s. A low ratio would be in the 5s. So let that soak in a little bit and we'll move on to the next subject. I've talked too much already. So the old Muncie rated around 300 to 320 foot-pounds of torque. That's how much stress it can take before it breaks. Again, not a universal test, but most transmissions reference that number, or you can look it up. And they only came in a 220 first gear ratio, the close ratio transmissions, and a 254 wide ratio. The M20 was the wide ratio. The M21 and M22 were both close ratio. I have broken a lot of Muncies. I'm not a big fan. This is the only one I keep, and I keep it for a dummy because with a Bellhausen bolted on, it's the same length as a Power Glide, a Turbo 350, a Super T10, and obviously a Muncie, also a Saginaw 3 or 4 speed, or the cast iron Muncie 4 speed. So it's handy for a mock-up. Actual use, again, in its intended capacity. Back in the day when these were used, obviously you could buy one behind a big block, the LS6, the baddest big block ever made in 1970, you had a Muncie. It could live because you got your torque in and you got how much the tires hook coming out. So that's your own test. I was talking about the test bench a minute ago. Well, the car is a test bench. If you put a sticky slick on that car on a sticky track, that transmission will fall on the ground. But they only had 7-inch tires and they didn't hook up that much. And when they did, that's when they had to start modifying the transmission. So if you have an old muscle car with a Muncie in it, or a Super T10, you're only going to get so far before you need aftermarket help. So the legend of, a real man's car has 3 pedals and I'm faster with a 4-speed, that only lasted until torque converter and automatic transmission technology took off. And nowadays they're not even on the same planet. The Turbo 400 is still going faster and faster. And this old grandpa here, not going anywhere. And now on to one of my personal favorites, the BorgWarner Super T10. It took over for General Motors. The Muncie was phased out, and the Super T10, because in the early 60s they'd used a regular T10. I'm not talking about those today. Those aren't that strong, and they're really hard to find and collectible, so it's a dangerous combination. The Super T10, there's still plenty of them out there. I find them pretty much in original condition, and they're still serviceable. They're available in 5 different ratios, combinations. 243 being the close ratio version. That was rated for 375 foot-pounds, and as first gear got lower, so did the torque rating. All the way to 342, I believe, was the lowest rating, around 300 foot-pounds. This version, you can count the rings. This is a 3-ring, makes it a 264. The 342 first gear is an interesting combination. It's the same concept that the Doug Nash 4+1 that we're going to talk about next also tried to accomplish, is have a super low first gear combined with a high rear axle ratio. So you can accelerate in that decent first gear overall ratio, and when you're in 4th gear, which is still 1-to-1, no overdrives yet, you could cruise down the highway. This transmission happens to be outfitted with one of my beautiful shifters, but suddenly I'm Vanna White. This is a Doug Nash 4+1 Street 5-speed. I picked it up a couple weeks ago. I haven't cleaned it. All I've done is install a shift handle and knob my buddy gave me, which actually fits the pattern. I joked when he gave me the knob and handle that I'd find a transmission for it. Next thing you know, I'm driving to buy this baby. This is a street version. It's rated for 450 foot-pounds, and it's 3.28 first gear. So that's a really low first gear and a high torque rating. In the overdrive version, which is still sold today, they're rated for 600 foot-pounds. They got this strength. You may notice it's kind of tall. They separated the cluster and the top line of gears, and they're slightly bigger, obviously stronger. This was made to fit where a Super T10 was, so the mount position, the bolt pattern, the input shaft, that all matches up. This would go into your car with relative ease. And in the late 70s, after the first couple gas crunches, there was a movement afoot to, eventually we ended up with overdrives, but in the interim, you still wanted a vehicle that could accelerate. Again, with a 3.28 first gear, you got that. And this is still 1-to-1 in high gear. So with this concept, you ran a high 2 rear end ratio, nothing more than maybe a 308 at the most. But most of them anywhere from 250 to 270. If you had plenty of power on tap, this was a nice driving vehicle. I'm actually excited to clean this up. Maybe modify the shifter a little bit, trim off these long pieces using my foot as a pointer. And I'm pretty excited to buy this. I got it reasonable. And it will end up in a project. The race version, if you are shopping for an old Doug Nash, Richmond bought them. I'm going to roll this around. The crash box version, the non-street, has a giant bulge right here. And some didn't have, this is a support bearing in the middle. You want that recessed with an Allen bolt right there in any of them, because that means it has extra support inside. Things to look for the old Doug Nash. The Doug Nash was bought by Richmond, and this transmission is pretty much still for sale today. And in the crash box version, we haven't talked about synchros yet, but this is a synchronized transmission, which means it's great for street driving. You can just go from one gear to the next without a lot of crunching or crashing, but at high RPM. And this transmission does have larger gears, so at a certain RPM point, it's going to start shifting like a truck transmission. They counteracted that with lighter weight gears and dog ring. They pro shifted them first, which means they cut like every other synchro tooth off, which is pretty small. Eventually went to face plating, a dog collar type shifting synchros that are noisy in everyday operation, but at wide open throttle, they shift really well. You just touch the clutch and it pops right into the next gear. They also make clutchless versions, but that's a whole nother story. If you're buying a clutchless manual transmission, it probably won't stay in gear when you let off the throttle. Depends on the synchros, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Here in my Model A project is a TKO 500. That 500 is 500 foot-pounds capacity. They also made a TKO 600. And yes, 600 is the capacity. These have overdrive. They have a few ratio sets available, and they have a really, I think, a 0.67 or a 0.76 overdrive. This transmission tried to give you the best of both worlds with a decent overall first gear ratio for acceleration and the overdrive to make it good for cruising. This is a rail type shifter. The shifter's in the middle. There's no external linkage. Makes for a nicer packaging, not necessarily nicer shifting, but you can get used to anything given enough practice. Tremec just released a new transmission, said to shift a lot nicer at higher RPM. Still fits in the same space, perhaps even better than this one did. Pretty exciting that new street type manual transmissions are still being made and released. If you wanted to go fast back in the late 60s, early 70s, you probably weren't going to do it with an automatic. Automatic transmission technology and torque converter technology was not there yet. Manual transmission technology, if you owned a General Motors, you knew that your Muncie couldn't take it. It was already broken. aftermarket manufacturers were going to take the best transmission of the time. At that time, it started as a Chrysler 4-speed, and they would put their aftermarket gear sets in it. And that's what the early 70s was all about. You could put it in any make. They would make different length input shafts and change the bolt pattern and mounting and shifter positions, and you could put your Chrysler 4-speed in your Camaro. It was pro shifted. They hadn't come up with synchronizer technology that was superior like it is nowadays, but they were certainly a better jump over the stock brass synchros called the crash box, and that's what got you through. The Ford top loader was probably equal in strength, but the aftermarket hadn't grabbed a hold of it yet. This unit is a Jericho. I'm going to tell the story about that in a minute. This is made to fit a General Motors. This was really popular in NASCAR. NASCAR ran the Super T10 for the longest time. They were transitioning over to this when they decided to move the driver closer. So they're still running a version of the Jericho, among others. They're all different names, but they're all based on the top loader variety transmission. Everything goes in the top cover. Shift shafts are just sticking out of the side, but you load the gears in through the top, hence the name top loader. A lot of the other 4-speeds, you got to go in through the side cover. This is a cool design, makes inspecting it really easy. But now they run the same basic transmission with a different shifter on the top, so they can move everything over toward the middle of the car. This is NASCAR. In drag racing, the twin countershaft clutchless transmission still rules in Pro Stock. And we could get into all kinds of racing transmissions, but I'm going too far off the reservation already. But if you want to buy a dog ring transmission so you can go racing with a manual transmission 4-speed, G-Force, among others, do the super version of the Super T10, rated for 900 something-ish foot-pounds of torque. It still looks like a T10. It still fits where a T10 fit before. And this is a Jericho. You can buy this GM version of a 4-speed to bolt right in. And those all run around $5,000. So not cheap. You're going to break lots of stuff, but if having 3 pedals is your deal, you can still do it. Better than ever. So the quick story about the Jericho. A week ago Friday, I went to look at it. It was advertised. I saw it late on Thursday night on Marketplace. Advertised as a 4-speed, super reasonable price. It looked just like it does now. I haven't touched it. For a GM, I had a few clues and a few doubts. Next to it was clearly a 7-bolt side cover Muncie that had first and second removed because it was in a stock car. This was also a spare for a stock car. They like to take first and second gear out of them. I was hopeful it was a 4-speed. I mean, in NASCAR, they still run a 4-speed. They use all the gears, but your local roundy-round tracks, they want to take first and second gear out, and then they stall the thing 50 times in the pits just trying to get it rolling. Not going to go off on that tangent. I wish they wouldn't, but I have broken enough Muncies. I've stripped first and second out of so many Muncies, I probably made most of those transmissions for them with my clutch pedal. So it's advertised. I get to the guy's house. I have Jericho's phone number on my phone, and I was going to inspect it, and if I had any questions, I was going to call him. It says they're open till 6 o'clock. I get there. I take a pair of vice grips. I've done minimal research about my Jericho because I was busy that day, but I know enough to make sure it shifts in all positions. You got first and second, third and fourth. This is reverse. Third and fourth, no problem. Reverse works. This only works one direction. So I asked him if it's okay. I brought tools. He didn't care. I popped the top cover off, and sure enough, there's no first gears in it. This was made as a 3-speed. So I go outside, and I'm going to call Jericho and ask if I can buy enough parts to make it a 4-speed or enough gears to make it low enough. I got it calculated. It's about 1.5 to 1 in first gear. That's not going to be real drivable. So I go back, and anyway, I called Jericho. Nice lady answers the phone. Everybody gone home for the weekend. I wasn't going to get any answers. And if I didn't buy this, it's not going to be there next week by the time I science it out. So it's one of those things, do you leap or not? I've always wanted, this has got the dog rings in it. I'm already looking at it. It looks just like brand new inside, straight cut gears, big dog ring synchros. This thing would shift gangbusters if you could get it rolling with the high second gear. I guess we're going to call it first because it's technically made as a 3-speed. Long story short, obviously I bought it. He took a quarter of the price, the reasonable asking price. He knocked off another quarter of that. I couldn't say no. There's no way I could go wrong. I'll have to do something with it. So I dragged it home, called Jericho on Monday, gave him the serial number off it that's right there. He confirmed who it was built for, definitely built as a 3-speed. Gave me the ratios. It's 1.57. I was just, checking input and output. And 123 second gear, 1-to-1 high gear. So my hopes in this conversation with Jericho, that they're super helpful. They know everything about these. Obviously, it's all they do. That I could either make a usable first gear and keep it a 3-speed. Wouldn't be the end of the world. It's just going in a hot rod. Or ultimately convert it to a 4-speed. Then I can use it in anything I want it to. It's got like I say, it's rated for 1,250 foot-pounds, 1,000 horsepower. Not going to happen. It costs more to convert the gears to a 4-speed than it would to sell me a new one for $5,200 without a shifter. And 3-speed ratios, he didn't offer anything much lower. It was possible, but I was going to spend thousands to do that with not much gain. Because I was looking at least to make it equivalent of somewhere around 2 to 220, so it would be similar to a close ratio 4-speed and somewhat drivable. So I own it now. The only way to make it drivable, if I built a fairly light hot rod and had a 488 to 513 gear, which wouldn't be the end of the world if I didn't want to go more than 60 miles an hour. I'm probably not going to go on the highway with it anyway. You could really wheel the shifter and it'd probably accelerate okay. So, hey, it's here. I'm going to do something with it. As I've mentioned, I build shifters. It would have to be a special shifter. I don't think I want an H pattern because you're going to start. It's going to be a 3-speed. And reverse is going to be like a 4-speed, so it's not going to be your traditional 3-speed shifting pattern. I have an inline shifter, the Hurst version of the Mr. Gasket V-Gate. Pretty rare shifter. I could set that up so I would pull up, put it in second, and then I'd go third, fourth. Well, let's correct that now. I'd put it in first, and then second, third, because it's only a 3-speed. So that's the story on that. It was too good to leave behind. It sucks that my plan fell through. I couldn't get guidance, make a more informed decision. But to be honest, for the price, I wouldn't have said no anyway. If nothing, but it's a good conversation piece. So, but it's way more than that. This is a heck of a transmission. Just the ideal ratio is not in it. But in the future, I will do something with it. So while it's here on the bench, it's too hot outside to continue my cleaning project, and let's face it, I was looking for a diversion anyway. I'm going to go ahead and build a shifter for it. Might even shoot a video. You never know. Hope you got something out of this. Next time, I might be showing you the cool shifter I built. I might be showing you something else. Enjoy the day. Talk to you soon. Like, share, subscribe. Got to say that every time they tell me, so everybody works it in somewhere. Catch you later. Bye.